Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Sherry Hendorf. I'm the chair of the Department of Ethnic Studies, and it is truly my honor to be here to introduce my colleague, Professor Catherine Ceniza Choy. I've known Professor Choy now for nearly 7 years, and I can tell you with great authority that no one is more deserving of this honor, being recognized as the Berkeley Writer at Work, than she is. So congratulations, my colleague. A historian by training, Professor Choy is an award-winning scholar whose work focuses on the subjects of Filipino studies, labor, international migration, adoption, and the history of nursing. She is the author of 2 books. Her first book, and I see they're here, so I'm going to do show and tell, Empire of Care, Nursing and Migration in Filipino-American History, is an award-winning study of why the Philippines became the world's leading exporter of nurses to the United States. A question that involves taking account of issues of migration, labor, globalization, and the enduring effects of colonization. In her second book, Global Families, A History of Asian International Adoption in America, Professor Choy limns the origins of the high rates of Asian adoptions in the United States, a story with origins in the post-World War II presence of U.S. soldiers in Asia. Reviewers have widely praised her work for its meticulous research and eloquent writing, as well as for challenging the stories that historians conventionally tell, calling attention to stories that frequently fall out of official histories, and masterfully analyzing the ways that global forces shape the experiences of individuals and communities. Professor Choy's writing is remarkable for its high profile and for its range. Her intellectual curiosity has led her down many paths, and she has written a wide range of essays on such topics as graphic novels, films, and posters that engage issues of migration, labor, and social inequalities. She remains highly prolific even under difficult circumstances. This was true even when she served for 3 years as our department chair, a job that demands every minute you can devote to it. And I only wish that I could be as productive as she was when she was in this role. She has lessons to teach us all, whether we are beginning writers or professional scholars, and I will be here with you with my notebook in hand, eager to learn from her. Please join me in welcoming Professor Catherine Ceniza Choy.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be in your company. I want to thank Sherry for introducing me. I'm so grateful to be your colleague. And I greatly admire your current leadership as our department chair. And I want to thank John Levine and the college writing programs for this awesome series, really, Berkeley Writers at Work. The writing process is something that means so much to me, not just my livelihood, my career, but my life. So it's truly an honor to be here. I'm going to read today from a selection of works. And since October is Filipino-American History Month, I thought I would begin by reading an excerpt from the acknowledgments and the introduction of my first book, Empire of Care, Nursing and Migration in Filipino-American History, which was published by Duke University Press in 2003 and co-published by Ateneo de Manila University Press. One of the most vivid memories of the research process for this book took place in my aunt's apartment in New York City. The apartment was typically abuzz with the conversations of elders, adults, and children because it was the main gathering place for my family to have dinner, play bingo, watch TV, and so on. However, it also happened to be the most convenient place to interview a Filipino nurse one evening. So that evening, my lolo, grandfather, Braulio Ceniza, Lola, my grandmother, Soledad Ceniza, Auntie Mary Hernandez, Aunts Lucy and Vicky, Cousin Brian, and my mother patiently and quietly waited in a bedroom as I interviewed the nurse in the living room for over 2 hours. Although the interview went well, I felt bad for inconveniencing my family. However, when the interview was over, they emerged from the bedroom smiling, offering the nurse something to eat, and talking excitedly and proudly about the project. For me, this experience exemplifies the ways in which my research was inextricably linked to family and community support, and challenges the notion that this book is a product of individual merit. I dedicate this book to my mother, Patria Ceniza, partly because of the ubiquity of the Filipino nurse in the United States and because of the book's subject matter. Many people assumed that she herself is a nurse, while her own personal history as a post-1965 Filipino immigrant certainly informed the scholarly choices I made about the research topics. Her professional background is in accounting. I dedicate this book to her for all the times she has confronted a Filipino friend who asked her incredulously, "What is Kathy going to do with a major in history?" I dedicate this book to her for all the times she has responded to such questions with pride about my passion for historical research. This book examines the unique and dynamic relationship between the professionalization of nursing and the 20th century migrations of Filipinos to the United States. Specifically, it analyzes the creation of an international Filipino professional nurse labor force primarily in the historical context of U.S. imperialism. In doing so, it asks us to reevaluate our most cherished cultural associations and assumptions about nursing, in particular, women's selfless and seemingly innate ability to care, as well as U.S. immigration, such as the inevitable assimilation of all immigrants. By acknowledging the complicated histories of nursing's role in U.S. colonialism and the racialization of Filipinos in the United States. It is my hope that this project helps us to confront the continuing legacies of U.S. imperialism, as well as to better understand the dynamics of contemporary U.S. migration and labor. In U.S. hospitals today, nursing is no longer exclusively practiced by white and black women in white uniforms. Between 1965 and 1988, more than 70,000 foreign nurses entered the United States, the majority coming from Asia. Although Korea, India, and Taiwan are among the top Asian sending countries, the Philippines is by far the leading supplier of nurses to the United States. The late 1960s marked the beginnings of a profound racial and ethnic transformation of the foreign-trained nursing labor force in the U.S. When the increasing migrations of Filipino nurses ended decades of numerical domination by foreign-trained nurses from European countries and Canada. By 1989, Filipino nurses comprised the overwhelming majority, 73%, of foreign nurse graduates in the United States, and Canadian nurses comprised the second largest group with 12%. Filipino nurses provide a critical source of labor for large metropolitan and public hospitals, primarily in the states of New York, New Jersey, California, Texas, Florida, and Massachusetts. In New York City, Filipinos comprise 18% of RN, or registered nurse, staff in the city's hospitals. Filipino nurses are also geographically clustered in Midwestern urban areas, in particular Chicago. Although the U.S. has been the leading destination for Filipino nurse migrants historically, and its early 20th century colonial relationship with the Philippines distinguishes it from other receiving countries of Filipino nurse migrants, the international migration of Filipino nurses is inextricably linked to the larger processes of global restructuring, in which the increased demands for services in highly developed countries, as well as the export of manufacturing to developing countries, have contributed to increasing worldwide mobility. In 1979, the authors of a World Health Organization, or WHO report, observed that the geographical distribution of the international migration of nurses was highly imbalanced. Of an estimated 15,000 nurses moving each year, over 90% went to 8 countries, mainly to the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. The authors also observed that among the nurse-sending countries, the largest outflow of nurses by far was from the Philippines. Although the WHO report's observations might be read in a celebratory way that speaks to the ability of the nurses' highly skilled training to cross national and cultural borders, it also illustrates how these professional migration flows are embedded in a global structure of power, in which nurses from countries with comparatively even higher nursing shortages are migrating to provide nursing care for populations of primarily highly developed countries. According to the WHO report, nurses are even more inequitably distributed around the world than are physicians. When 2/3 of the world's population living in developing countries have only a small fraction, 15%, of the world's nurses, international nurse migration patterns only exacerbate these inequalities of health services, inequalities that I refer to as an empire of care. And the second excerpt I'll be reading is from the introduction of my second book, Global Families, A History of Asian International Adoption in America, which was published by New York University Press in 2013. Where did your little girl come from? I was finishing my lunch and was about to get my 1-year-old daughter ready to visit another part of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts when I was taken off guard. Judging by the woman's age, early to mid-60s, I doubted she needed a lesson on the birds and the bees. Thus, I thought I had been asked a variation of the question that has been posed to virtually every Asian in the United States, whether they be newly arrived immigrants or fourth-generation Americans. Where are you from? This is a question for which New York City, the place of my birth, is not the right answer. My family is originally from the Philippines, I explained. My daughter is a third-generation Filipino-American, as well as a fourth-generation Korean and Chinese-American on her father's side. When the woman drew a blank look, it struck me that I had completely misinterpreted her question. She wanted to know from where in Asia I had adopted my daughter. She explained that her daughter had recently adopted a baby girl from China. It was then that I realized that the paradigm of the adopted Asian child had become so strong that it overrode common sense. Even though I'm Asian-looking, there was still the assumption that my daughter was adopted. International adoption from Asia has transformed the racial and ethnic landscape of the heartland of America to the point where, as in the situation I just described, it has become a social norm. According to a 2009 local news story, more than 13,000 Korean adoptees live in Minnesota. This is the largest number of Korean adoptees in any one place in the world. In the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, the phenomenon of Asian international adoption is especially visible because of its predominantly transracial nature, with primarily white parents adopting Asian children. During one visit with my daughter to our neighborhood playground, I observed that I was the only non-white parent of an Asian child. Asian international adoption in America is not solely a regional phenomenon, however. It has contributed to the transformation of the United States into an international adoption nation. The United States is the top recipient of internationally adopted children. According to the Evan B. Donaldson Adoption Institute, International adoptions in the US have more than doubled between 1991 and 2001. In the new millennium, Russia, Guatemala, Romania, and Ukraine are among the top sending countries of adoptive children to the United States. However, Asian children have comprised the majority of children internationally adopted by US citizens. Between 1971 and 2001, US citizens adopted 265,677 children from other countries. Over 156,000 of those children were from Asian countries. Asian international adoption has also made a mark on our national culture. It has become a powerful way to imagine contemporary US multiculturalism because it shapes one of the most intimate, emotionally laden, and cherished institutions, the family. The publicity about celebrities adopting internationally has made the American public highly aware of the possibility of families becoming transracial. In the early 21st century, for example, the omnipresent publicity of Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt's World's Most Beautiful Family, formed through the international adoption of a Cambodian boy, an Ethiopian girl, and a Vietnamese boy, in addition to their 3 biological children, has contributed to a popular perception of international and transracial adoption as a socially acceptable, if not desirable, way to create a family. A darker, more problematic side of international and transracial adoption of Asian children lurks alongside these celebratory narratives. Since the late 1990s, a growing body of memoirs, documentary films, and anthologies by Korean American adoptees who have come of age underscored the theme of their numerous mundane encounters with American racism. In doing so, they present a more nuanced, if not ambivalent, picture of Asian international adoption. In the first published anthology by and about Korean adoptees entitled Seeds from a Silent Tree, a Korean adoptee named Mi Ok Song Bruining writes about her American childhood. Adolescence is traumatic enough without being targeted for being racially different, culturally identified as alien, and looking like no one else, peer, child, or adult. I was stared at, harassed, bullied, called names, insulted, threatened, and verbally abused by other kids, younger and older, on a daily basis, on the school bus, in school, stores, restaurants, and many other public places in Rhode Island. These works remind us that the historical legacies of anti-Asian sentiment in the United States, codified, for example, in US immigration legislation, which targeted Asians for exclusion during the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, in US naturalization law that rendered Asian immigrants ineligible for citizenship until the 1940s and 1950s, and in anti-miscegenation laws in 14 states that prohibited interracial sex and marriage between Asians and whites until the US Supreme Court made such laws unconstitutional in 1967. These legacies persist in more recent times. The increasing popularity since the 1960s of the seemingly positive stereotype of Asian Americans as model minorities in relation to negative, less than model stereotypes of African Americans adds an additional layer of complexity regarding how race informs the phenomenon of Asian international adoption. Although positive and negative stereotypes of these communities are dehumanizing and dangerous, they have influenced both international and domestic adoption in the United States. Some scholars have argued that these stereotypes undergird a racial preference for Asian children over African American children. Other scholars have strongly criticized international adoption by documenting and highlighting a global market that transports babies from poorer to richer nations, likening it to a form of forced migration and human trafficking. Thus, Asian international adoption is simultaneously highly celebrated and deeply controversial. But these international and transracial sensibilities about family making and the heated debates that they generate are not as new as they seem. They have a history. And I'm just going to read one more, which is a bit different from my scholarly writing, but it's from a blog post that was published in July 2015. During that month, I wrote weekly blog posts about the writing process. This post is for all writers who are struggling with self-doubt, the kind of doubt that freezes you into inaction, that leaves you anxious and worn, that weighs you down with uncertainty and fear. I have been there. And I have learned that the healthiest way to deal with our own sabotage is to keep writing. Write down exactly what it is you want to accomplish: a novel, a scholarly book, an essay. It is okay, and sometimes even more effective, if you break down your goal into smaller, more achievable chunks: a chapter, 250 words, a paragraph, etc. Write consistently, ideally most days of the week, and your actions and persistence will lead you to create works that you have not yet imagined. Several days ago, I received a lovely email message from a librarian who I had met at the American Library Association 2015 annual conference. He thanked me for writing the book, Empire of Care, a book that was published over 10 years ago. He wrote, "Thank you for creating a work that showcases Filipino migration and diaspora history as a subject of serious scholarly pursuit. I will continue to refer budding scholars to that book should they ask me for research help at the library." As I read his message, I recalled the process of writing that book. I remembered my own bouts of self-doubt during the daily grind of writing. At the time, I was pregnant with my husband's and my first child, and at a particularly low moment, I thought to myself, I am working so hard, I am spending so much time on this, and no one will read this book. In hindsight, I realized that I could not have imagined the impact of my book because I hadn't written it yet, because my voice was still taking shape through the act of writing regularly. Thankfully, I knew what I wanted to do, to finish writing this book. I wrote this down many times, in multiple ways, in various journals. These written words were material manifestations of my desires, and at some point along the way, they became reminders of my ability to complete what I had started. Write down exactly what you want to accomplish with your writing, and then get there by writing it out. You will conquer your self-doubt, and your voice will take flight. Thank you very much.
I want to thank you again for agreeing to come today and to share your work. My name is John Levine from the College Writing Programs, and it's my pleasure and honor to coordinate this program. I want to thank the Morrison Library for opening their doors to us. I couldn't think of a more lovely setting to have this conversation. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about the format. Now that you've read and we've gotten to hear a little bit of your work, we're going to jump into a conversation about writing, a little bit about research, about your work. And then at the end, I'd like to open it up to the audience to see what questions they have, anything that piqued their interest. So you've been warned. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why we invited you here, and you actually addressed that in your reading because of the variety of writing that you do. I'll be honest, I'd read some of your work. I had not read your books before I invited you.
Okay.
After I read the books, I said, that seals the deal. I thoroughly enjoyed reading both of these books.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you for making your writing process and your research process transparent in that blog entry you just read.
Mm-hmm.
It was very revealing. Many of the people in our audience are writing students who are learning about writing. But I would venture to guess, like you, there are many people who have self-doubt about their own writing.
Absolutely.
So that was very revealing to hear about that. So can you talk a little bit about how you started writing? Was it once you became an academic? Did you write before that?
Let me think about this. About when?
Yeah.
Because I have been writing my whole life in some ways. As soon as I started to learn how to write. And I actually haven't blogged about this, but when I was in elementary school, I would carry a notebook around even at the playground. And I enjoyed writing poetry or just little things that would catch my eye. And in, I would say, maybe 7th or 8th grade, I started to write more seriously. I'm not saying that it was good, but I just tried to write more seriously. And I actually sent my poetry and some essays I wrote to places like 17 magazine. And 17 magazine rejected my pieces repeatedly, but they were so kind about it. And this is the pre-internet laptop days. So I actually still have saved this note from 17 magazine, which was a kind of a form letter, but the editor wrote something, personally thanking me for submitting a piece. And even though I was rejected, I was thrilled that I had this audience of at least maybe one person at 17 magazine. And I think from that experience, I learned to confront and deal with rejection right away. And I think because I was so young, I wasn't so disappointed or frustrated about it. I just told myself, well, that's okay. I'll just keep submitting things to other places. And I think that really served me well, like throughout high school and then college as my writing became even more serious with the expectations in the classroom. I was very fortunate that I encountered teachers who really cared about writing. And when I say they really cared about writing, I mean that they were willing to tell me when my writing was good, and they were also willing to tell me when my writing was not so good. And I knew that they cared because they read it. And it was a form of constructive, critical engagement. And I'm very grateful to them, because that just then built through my doctoral program in history at UCLA, writing the dissertation, these books, through these more recent blog posts on writing.
Yeah. Do you see a through line from those first rejections from 17 magazine to being told by writing teachers that this needs more work through your dissertation committee? The question sounds funny, but I'm serious. I think there's a certain predisposition about being able to accept rejection about your writing. Mm-hmm. Do you see that as all of a piece?
I definitely see that as a common experience. And rejection sounds so negative.
Yeah.
But I really, I think I took it more as feedback. That they were willing to listen, to read, and to give me feedback, and I could build upon that. But I'm not sure, maybe even back then, maybe even at an earlier age, I also think I understood that rejection, feedback, criticism is part of the process, but that I also need to honor my voice and who I am, and I can't write the way someone else wants me to write, but I can certainly listen and learn from people's feedback.
Interesting. I was going to ask about this later, but yeah, it's a natural place to bring it in. So when you're giving feedback to other people, colleagues, students,
Yes.
is it the same thing? Are you aware of what kind of feedback you're giving, when you're giving the feedback, et cetera?
Yes.
Yes, okay, yes.
Yes, that's the short answer.
Okay.
I work with and advise and have advised a number of doctoral students in our PhD program in ethnic studies. Prior to being here at UC Berkeley, I was an assistant professor of American Studies at the University of Minnesota, and I co-chaired 2 dissertation committees there. And I am very conscious about that, about giving critical but constructive feedback. And I'm also very conscious, I don't know how successful this is, but this is what I try. Sometimes I try to give critical feedback, and then other times I try to just step back and let the student also work things out for himself or herself. Mm-hmm. I think that sometimes too much hands-on criticism can be discouraging and frustrating. And so I try to be encouraging, although sometimes I think people think I'm scary and discouraging.
Are you able to temper it? I mean, depending on who the person is, and perhaps with people you know, do you give colleagues feedback, peers?
I have given colleagues feedback, but the way I've been doing it more recently has been anonymously, through an online writing group.
Okay.
And so I know that the other people in this writing group with me are other faculty members, not necessarily from Berkeley, but from around the world. And I don't necessarily give feedback. We don't necessarily share the content, but we do share process. And we try to give each other encouragement, but sometimes also advice.
Okay. I do want to talk about your books, because as I said, I found them fascinating reads. And what holds them together is that there's this political, socioeconomic thesis underneath each of them. If someone said Filipino nurses, international adoption, someone might say, well, it's political, but that's not the first thing that comes to mind. So what I'm wondering is, when you started these projects, did you have a thesis? Did you know where you were going with it? Can you just talk a little bit about how you got into each of these projects?
Sure. But to answer the question directly, I did not have a thesis in mind, actually, for either of the books. And sometimes you have certain hunches, but I have to say that didn't happen to me with these projects. I'm very much a researcher, scholar who becomes interested in a topic for scholarly, but also for personal reasons. And when I approach a research project, I really try to cast a wide net in terms of what I might find. I really try to keep an open mind as much as possible. And I look for things that surprise me. I have found that that's very productive in historical research, that oftentimes it's what surprises you, like puzzles, contradictions, that can be the most original insight you could have. So I didn't have a strong thesis at first. And I have to say, Empire of Care was first my dissertation, and then I revised it into a book during my first few years at the University of Minnesota. And I kept this journal about the process to just help me vent. Because at a certain point, your partner and your friends can only take that so much, So I would vent in this journal, and one of the recurring themes would be, I have no idea what I'm doing as I'm interviewing these nurses, as I'm auditing a nursing class in the Philippines, as I am visiting this nursing special collections in Boston. And somehow, out of this process of doing the research and the reading, and most of all the writing, I think the argumentation became clearer to me, but it was not something I had started out with. Similar too with the adoption book as well. I started that project because as I was reading from that excerpt, I was in Minnesota. I was encountering Korean adoptees in my Asian American Studies classes. And so I had approached this project really about Korean international adoption. And then when I went into the archive, I realized that there were many other histories of Asian international adoption from Japan, from Hong Kong, that I felt was not yet being discussed about in scholarship, and that surprised me and fascinated me. And so it was, again, in the act of research and writing and rewriting that the argumentation for global families became more clear.
Yeah, and that's another thing I love about this book, and you shared that, the opening anecdote about being at someone assuming that your daughter, because she looked Asian, that she was adopted. It's just to dissect it a little bit, it's an entry into the book, into the story. It invites us, and yet it's so telling of what your book actually gets into. And then in the book, we have appearances by Jane Russell and Pearl S. Buck, and just to name a few. So you take us through this odyssey, and yet you're constantly reminding us that this is not just a story of adoption. This is a story about politics, of colonialism, especially in the nursing book. And the other thing I wanted to talk about, and you mentioned it in your opening reading, about how the research for this was a very personal journey for you. I mean, you were conducting your research, hands-on research, in your aunt's apartment, and the rest of your family made room for you. And I think a lot of, at least beginning research students, think of research as this sterile process that happens in a dusty library. Well, back in the old days, it happened in a dusty library. Not that there's any dust in the Marston Library, but or online. And I think too often it's misperceived as not a personal process. Would you say that has that been your experience? That's what research is. It has to come from a personal place.
I don't think it necessarily has to come from a personal place in the sense that you have experienced this personally. But I actually think that many scholars are motivated by some kind of personal reason. And I say this as I think this idea of being motivated by personal experience is quite common in the interdiscipline of ethnic studies. I think many scholars are motivated by seeing such major gaps in scholarship, in historical scholarship, which is what I do, and they don't see themselves there. They don't see their families. They don't see their communities, and they're motivated by that. And I know that that's not just true for ethnic studies scholars, because I have encountered other historians who do immigration or political history, and there is some kind of personal connection, even though they may not call attention to it.
When you're writing, whatever the project happens to be, do you have an audience in mind? Do you have an ideal audience in mind? And it may be different for differing projects.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something, when I was a graduate student writing, and you're writing your dissertation, your audience is really your dissertation committee. No, the chances are not, no one else is going to read it in general. And one of the things that was different for me when I was revising the dissertation into a book was the publishers I was working with, and these are university press, this is scholarly publishing, not trade publishing, but they said to me, you have to keep in mind your audience. Who's your audience? And I guess I hadn't thought about it, to be honest, in such a serious, conscious way. But I realized that was very important for that book. And when I was writing Global Families, I think I definitely had more of specific audiences in mind. Certainly, the community of adoptees, adoptive parents, social service agencies working on adoption. I had that community in mind. I also had the community of Asian American studies and ethnic studies scholars in mind, because I felt that adoption studies had been marginalized in those fields when it shouldn't be. So I do think about it a bit.
And do you have is it a different audience when you're writing, say, an academic journal article, as opposed to, both of these books are very accessible, whether or not you're in that niche of those groups you mentioned, it's very accessible. So do you have a different, I'll just be blunt, do you use jargon when you write for an academic journal? Maybe we don't think of it as jargon. Is there a difference in the language you use?
Yeah, in general, even though I know that for scholarly journal articles, that the audience is going to be much more specialized. So I do have that in mind, where I don't necessarily have to explain things in the same way I would explain things in my books. But that said, this issue of accessibility in writing is really important to me. It's something I value very much. And I keep that in mind in all the writing I do, from the blog posts to grant proposals to the books. And even though the books are scholarly books, trying to be cognizant of jargon and trying to say things in a simple but also meaningful way is very important to me.
Does that happen in revision? Do you find yourself making things more accessible in your own as you go through drafts?
Yes, I do that in revision. I also did something a bit different in Empire of Care. I interviewed over 40 Filipino nurses for Empire of Care. And one of the things I did when I was revising the dissertation into a book was I sent each and every one of them a draft of the book manuscript, the entire manuscript. And that's not the traditional protocol to do that, but I did that because many of these women were still alive, and many had agreed to use their real names. And it meant a lot to me that they would be portrayed with dignity, humanity. And so I did that. And so accessibility to the broader communities, such as Filipino nurses in this case, is something that I highly value.
Yeah. To shift gears a little bit, because I did mention that you have a variety of writing. Yes. I told you earlier that a piece that you wrote, which I was really taken with, is a creative nonfiction piece. I'm trying to find it here, about watching your daughter learn how to dive.
Yes, learning how to swim and learning how to jump into a pool.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of that piece? How did that come about? And also, is that a different process than writing Empire of Care than writing a scholarly article?
Yeah, I do think it's a different process. Even though I struggle with my writing, like many writers, I love writing. And the things I want to write about cannot always be contained in scholarly books. So I had this experience, as you were mentioning, observing my daughter, who was maybe 6 years old at the time, learning how to swim. And she was learning how to swim in this public pool here in Berkeley. And I was just thinking as a historian, I was watching this as a mother, but also as a historian, that how grateful I was that she had this accessibility to the public swimming pool, because I know that that was not available to people of color throughout the 20th century. And I know that for Filipino young people, which my daughter is of Filipino descent, that that was not available to them. They swam in segregated places in the 20s and 30s. And it made me appreciate the moment that much more, and I felt like I needed to write about it. To share both my personal joy at seeing her learn swimming, which is an incredible skill, but also that appreciation of swimming in historical context.
And when you began that essay, did you know what it was about? Did you know that, okay, I can tell this story of my daughter learning to swim, and yet it has all of these other implications? Or did you discover part of that during writing? I don't know if you remember the process.
Yes, I do remember at the very beginning, I wanted to acknowledge the historical context that I just talked about. But there was something else that was motivating me, which was Asian American history, and how being a parent, an Asian American parent myself, and raising Asian American children, how I have had to confront from my children questions like, Mommy, even though they've primarily grown up here in Berkeley, Mommy, are we black or white? Mm-hmm. And I guess when I was in that, watching my daughter, that question was haunting me. And so I used that essay to talk about personal experience, the historical context, but also how marginal Asian American history continues to be, even though we've made great strides. But we still have a lot of work to do, especially in K through 12. Mm-hmm. So there were so many things, I think, going on that I knew I wanted to write about. And yes, they came together in that way.
And you wove them in beautifully. A little bit about your writing process yourself, if you don't mind.
Sure.
When do you write, and is it the same time every day?
Definitely not at the same time every day.
Okay.
My ideal time is first thing in the morning before I check email or Facebook or something like that. I find that to be very productive, and I feel good about it.
Okay, and you heard it here, scholars do use Facebook.
Yes, but it doesn't always happen that way, despite my best intentions. And so actually in one of the blog posts I wrote about writing, one of the strategies that I shared is we ought to write whenever we can write, whether it's the first thing in the morning or it's just 15 minutes in between, lunch and an office hour, or whether it's just half an hour before more social media feed in the evening. And it all adds up and it all counts and it's all good.
Okay, so you don't have to have a 4-hour block, you don't have to have a day of writing to be able to get some writing done.
Right, I actually think that that's a misconception or misperception. I think many of us, including myself, have thought that in order to be productive, I need like a lot of time, like right now. You know, I need this 4-hour block. But rarely do we have that 4-hour block. And even when we do have it, I think many of us find that we didn't get as much done as we thought we would.
And then we beat ourselves up.
Yes. And then we become, victims of our own sabotage.
That's right.
And so the way to do it is to write when you can. And even those short bursts of writing, they count. And they can actually, surprisingly, be more productive. So don't underestimate.
Interesting.
that.
Are you able to write every day?
I think I'm able, but I don't.
Okay.
I'll just be honest
Okay.
about it. I think I could write every day, but I don't, like everyone else. I feel a little burned out, or I'm just doing other things, or I feel a little bit overwhelmed. But I try to write every day, and most days I do.
Okay. So with those 20 or 30-minute bursts, if that's all you have, does that make you a faster writer? Would you call, if I asked if you were a fast writer or a slow writer or somewhere in between, would you be able to put yourself on the spectrum?
Yeah, I would definitely say somewhere in between. I would say somewhere in between, because sometimes I'm able to, if there's a major deadline, or if there's, I don't know, I have been in that mode where I get into that zone and things happen with my writing. And the blog posts were really fun in that sense, because I felt as though I'm not going to spend 10 years writing a blog post. So there's this finite piece of time, and here's the afternoon, and I'm going to do this, and it's going to get done.
Okay, good. What's the most challenging part of writing for you, would you say? What do you grapple with the most in your writing process?
I think the hardest part of writing is an aspect of scholarly writing. This is something I don't encounter as much with my blog posts, but as a historian, having to synthesize so much of the data or the primary sources that we use, synthesize that with the scholarly conversations that have taken place or are taking place about the topic at hand, and then trying to include my own original insights. I think that process of weaving those things together, and then I do think it takes courage to write that out.
Would you talk more about that courage in writing? I mean, I agree, it does take courage.
Yeah. It takes courage because you won't get it right the first time, because what you're writing is probably not going to be that great initially. It's not going to be original or interesting. And I think that confrontation with a very human side of ourselves, as having to work through something, through writing and revision, is very difficult to confront, and I think it takes bravery and courage to get through that.
Do you prefer writing or rewriting?
I sometimes it really depends on the piece. Sometimes I like the initial writing, and other times I've just hated that part, and then I've enjoyed the rewriting.
And does it just depend on external factors, or is it the particular subject matter?
It's the particular subject.
I see.
It's the particular subject.
Okay. A lot of beginning writers don't like rewriting. I wrote it, I don't want to write it again, and I totally understand. I tell my students that, yeah, this is a writing class, not a rewriting class. And I try to tell them, we've heard it all before, writing is rewriting.
Absolutely.
Do you have a take on that? Can you...
My take is that that's absolutely correct.
Okay.
That's absolutely correct.
Did you know that when you were writing when you were submitting to 17 magazine, when you were in 7th grade? I mean, when did that come for you? Because it didn't come to me immediately. It was in graduate school that I finally figured it out. But
right. It didn't come to me immediately either. And I think that's part of the reason why I got so many rejection letters, is because one had to do with my own voice and lack of experience. But the other thing was that as a young writer, I was just used to writing something and then thinking, okay, that sounds about right, and then sending it off, and not realizing that, yes, it should probably be rewritten. And I'm not just talking about proofreading. I'm talking about, are there better ways to articulate my major points?
And do you know at this point when something is finished? Do you know when you've rewritten enough?
That's a great question, because I think that many scholars, many writers, they can't let go. They can't let go because I think there's sometimes that desire to have, this is it. You know, this is the perfect piece, and I can do no better. For me, I have found that it's just so difficult. That's such a high bar to set. And I see my writing as engaging in a conversation with readers and other writers. And so even with my books, I had thought there's more I could do with Empire of Care and Global Families, but I let it go.
Okay. What is your ideal writing setting? I know you may not always have it, but
Right.
I mean, you have a family and you have other obligations, but ideally, what's the perfect writing setting for you? Place, time, maybe there's a cup of coffee, tea, I don't know. Tell us about it.
Yeah, okay. That's a great question. I should write about that.
Yes, there's the next blog.
My favorite writing or ideal writing place is actually in my university office. And yes, I will have coffee or tea with me. And I'm able to see photos of my family. Yeah, and be surrounded by other things that remind me of people and places that I love.
And are you able to, if you don't have that, can you write elsewhere if you're traveling or you can't get to your office? Are you able to write elsewhere, say on an
Yes.
airplane?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
And I will compel myself to write in various places. I actually think that builds writing muscle.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we shouldn't be wedded too much to that ideal place or the ideal time or the ideal drink. I think we need to push ourselves to be able to write in various scenarios, even the ones that may not be ideal, and to be proud of that fact.
And it's so
that
easy
ability.
to make excuses if there's no soy latte available. Well, can't write,
Yes.
sorry, can't do
Yes.
that. You mentioned you were keeping a journal when you were working on your dissertation
Yes.
and you had all of that doubt. Do you still keep a journal?
Yes, but I am not. I wish I could say I wrote in it every day, but sometimes I don't write in it as much as I should. But I do keep one. I keep one as a Word document. It's just a way of venting, of relieving my frustration, or if there's a thought in my mind that's bothering me for whatever reason, if I write it down, I feel better.
Okay. And how often do you go back and read what you wrote? Is it just
In the journal?
Yeah. I mean, is it a means of just venting, getting that done, and then moving on to the real work, or do you ever have time to go back?
Usually I don't go back, but I think when Empire of Care came out, and I was just so thrilled, just so thrilled seeing it in print, I went back and I had a good laugh.
Okay. All
Yeah,
right. So
and I
it was-
learned
it
a
was
lot
good for
about
that.
myself, and so I would encourage other people to keep a journal and of the highs and the lows. And sometimes we don't want to confront those lower points, but sometimes when we look back, we realize what we've been through, how much stronger we become.
A lot of our students are reading and composition students, and the other half of composition is reading. So let's talk a little bit about reading.
Yes.
What do you read?
Well, I read a lot in my fields. And I think there's, so one of my fields is Filipino-American history. And I'm so thrilled that there have been more books and publications in Filipino-American history. So I do a lot of rereading. And I've recently reread Carlos Bulosan's America is in the Heart, which is a seminal Filipino-American labor history, which if people in the audience haven't read, you should read. And I've also recently read Dawn Mabalon, who's a historian at San Francisco State University, who wrote a book called Little Manila is in the Heart, which is partly engaging with Carlos Bulosan's America's in the Heart, and is about the history of the development of a Filipino-American community in Stockton, California. So I read Bulosan's America's in the Heart so many times, but the act of rereading it is a joyful experience for me.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. So rereading, it is joyful. Do you find other benefits? Do you see things in a third reading that you didn't see in a first reading?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The first time I read Bulosan's America's in the Heart, I was a college student. And my immediate reaction to the book was one of anger, because what really struck me in the book was the history of such overt racism and violence against Filipinos in California and other parts of the West Coast in the 1920s and the 1930s. And that anger didn't necessarily go away when I reread it, but I also read for the other times. I read resilience in the novel. I read about friendship. I read about his own love for reading, and how reading and writing actually for him saved him from a very dark experience.
And how does reading influence your own writing?
Well, I do. I try to emulate some of my favorite scholarly writers. And so a mentor and one of my favorite writers is George Sanchez, who's an historian who wrote this book called Becoming Mexican American. And I really appreciated how he organized that book and how he, with each part, he had excerpts of the historical actors that he featured in the book, many of them being Mexican immigrants, Mexican Americans. And I just loved how he put that front and center. And then I emulated that in Empire of Care. I used it to help me organize the book, and it reminded me that those stories of the Filipino nurse migrants themselves are so important to why I researched and wrote the book. And it gave me a model for how to put it front and center.
Interesting. Do you read anything besides scholarly work?
Yes.
Okay. Would you mind sharing other things you read?
Sure. I read some poetry. I'm currently starting to read Bao Fi. He has a new book of poetry called Thousand Star Hotel, which is about urban Asian America, which is about cases of continuing brutality and racism against Asian Americans, and is also about him being an Asian American father to an Asian American daughter. So that's one thing.
Okay.
I recently read Mia Alvar's collection of short stories called In the Country, which features short stories inspired by the global migration of Filipinos to not just the United States, but also to the Middle East.
Do you try to vary your reading diet, or does it just happen? Do you think, well, I need to read some poetry because I've been reading a lot of academic journal work?
Yeah, it's not so purposeful, but I do like the variety. I will say that I enjoy reading, because this might be surprising, I enjoy reading like personal finance.
Oh, okay. Now we're getting
Articles.
somewhere. Okay, tell us about that.
I just sometimes, for example, that you can find in Money Magazine, or whether it's like the New York Times will have personal finance. I just think it's important to be aware of theoretical ideas and histories, but I also think we need to think about very practical things in our lives, like money as a tool and as a resource, and how to best use that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I do want to leave time for the audience to ask questions. What are you writing right now? What topics or issues are on your front burner? What's on your back burner? I'm assuming you have more than one idea.
Yes, there are a number of things that I'm working on. I think the one thing I'll mention is I am working on this book project of Filipino-American women's biographies. And I've been hoping that this project will feature individual Filipino-American women's lives throughout the 20th century as a way to have us think about the impact of US colonialism in the Philippines, but also to honor and to document and preserve the many contributions Filipino-American women have made to the United States and to the Philippines. And this comes from things like, one of the women I'm looking at, Ines Cayaban, was a nurse, a public health nurse on Hawaiian sugar plantations in the early 20th century, and then she became a pioneer in cancer prevention there. Another individual I'm looking at is Victoria Manalo Draves, who is a mixed race Filipina-American woman who was segregated from a swimming pool and a swim club in the 30s, and then went on to become the first woman to win 2 individual gold medals at the 1948 Olympics in diving events. And we should know about these women.
Right, yeah. I want to open up the floor to questions. And if you have a question, if you could raise your hand, we have a mic that will come to you so that we can hear the question. Yes?
Yeah, good noon, Professor Choi. Yeah, I'm from China, and I'm really interested in your book, Global Families, A History of Asian International Adoption in America. And from the perspective of history, this book may prove to be the most important fact about the 20th century. You know, international adoption, this issue is very sensitive in China. We couldn't, it's really hard for me to find such issues in newspaper. I just knew this topic when I studied in the South Korea. I read Jin Zhong Chuankat's The Language of Book. I don't know whether you have heard of this book or not. Yeah, I have translated this book into Chinese, but I don't know whether I could publish it in China or not. Then I know there are also large numbers of Chinese adoptive children in the USA, but till now I couldn't find the literary works written by these Chinese adoptive children. I don't know why. So, do you know why we couldn't find literary works written by Chinese adoptive children in the USA?
Okay. Well, I think part of it has to do with the historical time period, and there's much more work written by and about Korean American adoptees because of the longer history of Korean international adoption that many scholars, including myself, locate after 1953 and after the end of the Korean War. And as a result of that, you have a much longer history, and you have multiple generations of Korean international adoptees who have come of age in a way that with Chinese international adoption, the one that we're most familiar with is the one that's more recent, from the late 1980s, early 1990s. And we're starting to see that those generations come of age and document their experiences. But it won't be the same as the Korean adoptees because of the different time periods.
Okay. Then in the Ethnic Studies Library, I found this book, A Passage to the Heart, Writings from Families with Children from China. Now this book is edited by Amy Klatskin. Now, then it's about Chinese adoption children story. Mm-hmm. Then I wonder, Korean government implements national policy for these adoptive children. How about Filipino government? Mm-hmm. How to deal with these Philippine adoptive children?
Yes, these are many great questions. I'd be happy to talk with you afterwards. I've actually done some research on Filipino international adoption, even though I didn't write so much about it in Global Families. But each of those countries has very distinct histories of international adoption. Sometimes they overlap, and sometimes they need to be treated differently. But thank you for your questions.
And we have another question.
Oh.
Over here.
Do you have a favorite piece of work that you created, and why is that your favorite, if so?
Wow, that's a great question. It's difficult for me to answer. It's hard to choose just one favorite. I will say that Empire of Care will always be a very special work. For me, it was my first book. It involved family and community involvement. And the impact of that book was a surprise to me. So I'm so grateful that it has been helpful to nursing schools, to Filipino American young people who've grown up in families where there are many Filipino nurses and have wondered about why that is. So it's hard to choose another work. So I would probably be Empire of Care. But the one that John was referring to about my daughter in Cheers to Muses, that's very special too, because it's my daughter, and now it's in print.
Another question?
Hi, Professor Choy.
Hi.
My question is because growing up as a Filipino American, I didn't really have any access to Phil-Am literature and stuff, and Phil-Am media. So are there places where Phil-Am literature and stuff they're more accessible, not just to Filipino Americans, but to any American in general?
I'm sorry. I think I don't know. I don't know if I heard the question.
Oh yeah.
We asked her about me.
What are sources of Filipino American literature, or
Where to find them and stuff.
where to find Filipino?
Because I didn't have any access to them growing up.
Oh, okay, great, thank you. That's a wonderful question, Vince. it's wonderful that we have so many more sources of Filipino-American literature available. And on our campus, the main library and the Ethnic Studies Library are great resources. Our Ethnic Studies Library has a section devoted to Asian American Studies works, and so you'll definitely find Filipino-American literary sources there. There's also actually in the San Francisco Main Public Library, there's actually a Filipino-American Center within the main library that features Philippine and Filipino-American works. And the new librarian, Abe Ignacio, is an alum of UC Berkeley's Ethnic Studies.
Thank you. I want to follow up on that really briefly.
One last question.
Just give a comment. I hope when you do finish this work on the biographies of Filipino American women, that you might think about partnering with someone to make that accessible to children, like those new books that have come out recently, like for Rebel Girls. But I think it should be for boys too. That's just the titling of those new books with 100 biographies of women. And I just wanted to ask, what feedback, if at all, did you get from those 40 nurses that you interviewed when you shared your manuscript? Did any of them give you some comments?
Yes, thanks so much. First, let me say that I think it is so important that we have more diverse children's literature. I mean, we have some diverse children's literature that we should access and read, but we also need more, especially in terms of Filipino-American history. And I am actually in discussion with someone about the possibility of that, of some of these women appearing in children's literature. But that's a great question. Thank you for asking about any follow-up comments I got from the nurses themselves. I was concerned that they might find my writing inaccessible and as a result, that they wouldn't identify maybe with the writing or appreciate it. But many of them actually, I was genuinely surprised by this, really appreciated the scholarly approach. And they had been wanting to see not just their labor and their contributions to US healthcare delivery acknowledged, but for it to be treated with respect in scholarly writing was important to them, and I was very happy to hear that. One nurse did write me, and she said, I don't have a problem with anything you've written, but when you have these excerpts of my interview, she was so concerned that she didn't sound articulate, that she was not eloquent. She was concerned that she sounded funny. And it was so interesting because I looked back at her excerpts, and actually I thought she was so eloquent. But I think when you're speaking, right, it's not the same thing as how you would write. So I told her I can change, or if you want me to take something out, I will honor that. But I reassured her that she sounded smart and informed, and that a broader audience needed to hear what she had to say. And she said, okay, that's good enough then for me.
And unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank the Morrison Library again for hosting it, and I want to thank Professor Choy for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.